The seeds of the next crisis were being sown when we failed to manage the last financial crisis properly. The question really is why it hasn't happened yet. It has been 10 years since the last financial crisis, and I think the answer to that is really the way that central banks have been managing economies. One of the things that has put the brakes on the sorts of events that we're expecting to see happen is that we're still many Western economies are still managing very low interest rate regimes. And until I think those interest rates start to shift, you're not going to see the kind of unraveling that you would expect to see when the next crisis comes. At the same time, thinking back to the credit crunch and the way that that finally became public knowledge, it became public knowledge when two funds sort of, the term that they use in the industry is they blew up. It seemed to be a very sudden event. And yet for people who are invested in those particular funds, Bear Stearns funds, they had been talking about it for many months before. So the thing is, for those of us who are not in the financial markets, these conversations are probably going on now. What is the big thing that will happen? What is the big blow up that will then stop experts from dealing with each other? Because that was a crux with the global financial crisis. It had nothing to do with whether the public trusted financial services. It had nothing really to do with whether the government trusted financial services. What stopped things in their tracks was when financial experts stopped trusting each other. So if you're looking for an indicator to watch, that's really what you need to watch, isn't it? It's, when the experts stop trusting each other. So you have to keep a very, very beady eye on them all the time. It's tiring, but you have to. I've written about various forms of omertas, not just in my book, but in other articles. I think the investment banking industry was really quite famous for it. Yes, and the people who are actually involved in helping financial institutions to organize silence don't necessarily see it that way. That's really sort of part of the success of omertas. And when you say omerta, what you're really talking about is these unwritten laws, what a lot of academics like to refer to as a symbolic law. It's something that's known, but it's not actually written down anywhere. For years, for example, we knew that with Goldman Sachs had this sort of unwritten rule that you didn't talk to the press. And this prevailed for a very long period of time. The company's been public for 20 years now, I think. But before that, it managed its image very, very carefully. And we can see that now with Facebook. Facebook manages its image so carefully. Only a certain elite few are allowed to speak on behalf of Facebook, even though it is effectively a media company that is inviting people in and is claiming that it's changing the world. So yes, even in this day and age of digital communication, when supposedly it's very easy to access information and to access it very quickly, it's still very possible to see organizations that are very, very controlled about what it is that they have to say. But in terms of the sorts of practices that I talk about in my book, where organizations and financial markets deliberately do organize silence, one of the most successful ways that they do this is through something that's called strategic ambiguity, where they're not quite clear. They never quite answer questions very clearly. They're not particularly clear on what the return on a particular product is going to be. And they have a whole set of phrases, which I'm sure many journalists collect and keep on the wall. One of my favorite ones is an investment where you ask, well, what kind of return can I expect? And they give you an answer over the market cycle. And you say, well, what do you mean by the market cycle? I guarantee you, if you ask 6 people in financial services what a market cycle is, they will all give you 6 different responses. It could be 5 years, could be 2 years. They're not really sure. It depends on the rotation of the market that we're in at the moment. It varies. So that's a very good example of strategic ambiguity. And I talk about various other kinds of practices in the book. The one that worries me far more is what a group of sociologists have called strategic ignorance. And this is really quite pervasive, this one. It's the one that allowed a whole lot of people to say, oh, we didn't see the financial crisis coming at all. Rubbish. Financial institutions were talking about it internally for a very long time. I personally worked on articles where people were talking about, the signs were coming, and there's got to be an end to easy credit because it can only end in tears. But the thing is, and you will find if you talk to people who manage departments in various kinds of financial institutions, is no matter what their gut was telling them, when they started to share this sort of story with clients didn't want to hear it. Clients just wanted to hear that, hey, the money is going to keep running. And what do you do when you've got sales targets? But the trouble is that after the crisis then happens, to keep sticking to this story that we didn't see the crisis coming means that we're not actually putting in place the structures that we need to see when it's going to happen the next time. I know there's a typical kind of argument that I've heard people like Alan Greenspan give when he was still head of the Fed, that in a way, there's all sorts of impossibilities that we can't possibly see into the future. So inevitably, crises are just going to keep happening. Well, it's fine to say that if you don't have to worry about how you're paying your next set of monthly bills. But for the very wide swathe of the population who do need to worry about things like that, we would prefer to at least try to see when another crisis is coming and plan for it. So I think there's a very big difference between the way that elites see crisis. In a way they see it as an opportunity. If you run a hedge fund, crisis, you're probably betting on it happening. But for the large portion of society, those, for taxpayers, citizens, consumers, it has an impact on us in such incredible, tangible ways, life-saving ways. I think that we should be at least trying to see when it comes. Well, I would agree with a lot of people who point out that in a way we talk about trust too much. I certainly find that Britain, the British media and public policy representatives talk about trust more than even some other Western countries tend to do. And we probably need to ask ourselves why that is. Why is it that Britain is so obsessed with trust? Because in truth, as a society, there's lots of institutions that we probably would be better off not trusting at all, And I'm not sure why we are giving people permission to feel that that would be okay. Why should you trust everything without asking questions? And I think in a way that answers the question. People who are running institutions don't want people asking too many questions. So if you trust, you're not going to ask those questions. So really, if we were all more cynical in a very healthy way, we probably would get our institutions to run far better on our behalf. So really, and I do say this in the book, particularly in the concluding chapter where I talk about really this obsession that we have with producing trust. And the industry that I was writing about, particularly the work of PR and marketing people in helping to kind of almost run a trust restoration industry, because they tend to ride in on their white horse every time there is a crisis and then work very, very assiduously to help organizations sort of rebuild trust in the public sphere. And I don't think that has been healthy for us as a society. Yeah, so this was this story that broke very recently. It would seem that the current UK government put the kibosh on efforts to raid company activity in LYCA-MOBILE. And I think that really is about a story about how elites work in financial markets these days and across politics, which is something that quite a few people at Goldsmiths have been writing about recently. We once had this idea about neoliberal capitalism where we'd have small government and government would step back and allow the markets to do what they wanted to do. But I have to say, every time we see a story like this, we can see how very, very carefully the state is entrenched in market activity. And they're not just nudging it along or stepping back and allowing it to do what it wants to do. It's really right there in the trenches with market elites as well. So in terms of trust, is there any trust involved here? Do we trust our governments? I think by and large we find that people don't really trust governments as much as they used to do in decades gone by. Do we trust large corporations? Probably not. Do we think that they're acting on our behalf? Probably not. However, I think we are continually disappointed when we find out that organizations like HMRC, who collect our taxes, aren't actually assiduously collecting taxes from the people we are trusting them to collect taxes from. So I think if there's a letdown in trust, I think that's probably where it tends to lie most, because we're thinking about HMRC primarily as being civil servants. And yet the way that they responded in the media to this particular story actually suggested much more of a political leaning than we would expect from what is part of Her Majesty's government. So I think it is surprising. It is, from my perspective, because I write about trust in financial markets, I kind of wake up every day, and if I were to start taking a pair of scissors and cutting up the newspaper, there would be no newspaper left by the time I'm done with stories about, the loss of trust. But I think, I really do think that we have failed to find the kind of leadership in the HMRC that we really deserve as a society. We certainly know that certainly large financial institutions have some of the largest PR and marketing machines of any organizations in the United Kingdom. I mean, some of them positively had armies, particularly leading up to the financial crisis. If you think about a big high street bank, for example, you could have an in-house communications machinery where you had groups of people representing one product only. I mean, that's how many people you're talking about. And because finance is such an important part of the British economy, and it continues to be, it's still a very, very important part of the economy. And it was very important in terms of providing advertising and marketing support to newspapers and to the many magazines, sort of magazines and trade publications that existed. Yes, this absolutely was a very big industry where journalists knew lots of people in the financial sector very well, and vice versa. Now, journalists, just because they know you well, doesn't mean that they have to like you. But over a period of time, there was kind of a chumminess, I think, particularly with the media who were dedicated to covering finance. And I can certainly see it from the media's perspective, because in many newsrooms, editors don't really give a toss about finance. So if there are journalists who are dedicated to covering this sector, they've probably been doing it for quite a long time. They are very, very expert in understanding particular products, particular services, the way that particular markets work. And over time, they actually know their contacts in financial services better than the general media will tend to do. And in a way, they become part of the same world. Now, some of the criticisms that emerged after the financial crisis were that the financial media probably didn't do a good enough job sort of critiquing what was going on in financial services. They've said that themselves. Journalists have said that themselves. But, I mean, I know for sure that many of them were. Many of them have had plenty of negative things to say over the years. But, this is an industry that, was allowed to continue to march on. It continued to provide news. It continued to provide content to the media. And I think that was very, very important. And it hasn't really quite gone away. If you were to pick up a newspaper midweek, at the current time of year, this is sort of taxation time. This is a time of year where a lot of new investment products become available. They're still providing content for a lot of the media. So there still is what some people refer to as a symbiotic relationship between finance and the media. And it's not a particularly modern concept. Financial media probably grew up in Britain, and it probably did that as far back as the Victorian era. So I don't think we're going to see that subside anytime soon. But I do think that there are plenty of people in the media who have been, keeping an eagle eye on financial services. It's just that once you've written your piece, will your editor publish it? That's one of the big questions. If you're a layperson trying to understand finance better, and you want to do your research and you want to look for people offering sort of a critical perspective on what's going on, not just always cheering on behalf of a new financial product or service or, a new company coming onto the market, I think you do have to do quite a bit of homework. For one thing, some of the best writing about financial services isn't free. It means you're having to take out a fairly hefty subscription for one of the better run monthly magazines or some of the better newspapers that are available. There is a lot of information on the internet. So I think that more people are finding that social media has become very effective, particularly because there are people in financial services who can use social media as a means of writing anonymously. And we knew this throughout the years that led up to the credit crunch and the financial crisis, for example. There were people writing anonymously about the hedge fund industry, for example, and the investment banking sector. So I think one of the best ways to get access to what people are saying and when they're saying it authoritatively now is to start with social media. It's one way, for example, that you can follow financial journalists whose work you cannot otherwise read because it's behind a paywall. So I find Twitter very useful for that. I think that after a few months of experience, you can start to pick up the difference between people touting conspiracy theories and people who are thinking thoughtfully. Also look out for journalists who have taken time off to go and write a book, because that book will usually contain a lot of the information that they haven't been able to publish in their day job. And there are many journalists in the United Kingdom who have taken time off to do that. It's something that Economist journalists are very well known for. So we don't know who they are when they're writing for The Economist, because The Economist still tends to publish most of its content anonymously, but every once in a while one of their journalists will take some time off to write a book. And there are a lot of journalists on Wall Street who are publishing books as well. I've seen quite a few of them coming out just in 2018 alone. So that's a really good starting point, and many of those books are quite affordable, so they're a very good place to start. The group really came together. It was started by myself and Jonna Montgomery, who we both teach at Goldsmiths. We teach in pretty different areas. Jonna teaches in political economy, and I teach in media and communications. And we both have research interests in finance and how finance does work, and mostly how finance doesn't work. And we also had these very, very big piles of books that we really keep meaning to get around to reading and just don't have the time. So we were having a chat one day and realized that there were more people like us around campus, but also people from the community who were meeting from time to time who really care very deeply about the fact that we didn't solve the problems in finance after the global financial crisis. There was a lot of talk, there was a lot of anger, there were some moves made, some of which are being sort of walked backward now. And instead of feeling helpless that we couldn't do anything, how could we use our own reading to form our thinking about the things that do need to keep changing, even if we're only operating in our own communities and at a grassroots level? So we have all sorts of people who come along to this group. And one of the things that I think is really good about it is that it's run on a very informal basis. There are academic reading groups where you have to come along and give a presentation of what you thought about the book, kind of with your essay in front of you. It kind of feels like a tutorial at university. Our group isn't like that. We are interested in, ideally, you're having read the entire book. That would be good. But equally, what we're really interested in is getting people in from all sorts of walks of life and all sorts of different perspectives, because that really is where you get the best kinds of conversation about how change could happen. So we've had people come along who are artists, who are interested in perhaps how finance is visualized, or how finance could be made more active for people who are excluded. We've had economists come along. We've got people who work in media. We've had people who work in the financial sector. We've got people who are interested in issues such as housing rights, community cohesion, you name it. They're just really interested in learning more about finance from each other rather than sitting and listening to an expert lecture. So everyone's welcome, and it really doesn't matter whether you live in South London or not. We've got people who travel in by train from quite a far away to attend the group, just because it's the only kind of place where they can sit down and have a talk about finance with people who aren't kind of droning on at them about how great this product or service is. And we do now have these kind of virtual satellite reading groups of people who aren't able to join us on the first Monday of the month. We've had members who have, gone back home to maybe Ireland, places like that, who are now just reading along with us virtually, even though they can't attend, which is great as well. The more people that we can get interested in realizing that finance is about people, and it's not this sort of opaque place that's kept behind a very high, dungeon wall that can't be accessed. It can be understood, and it can be understood in lots of different ways. I think the better off we'll be as a society. So ultimately, it's a group that really kind of speaks to my passion to get more people to speak back to finance and say how we want finance to work for us.